In this lesson, we're going to add select box element to every timeline item component, so that users will be able to select particular activity for every hour. But before, we're going to move timeline items array that is defined within the timeline component to the up root component, so that the timeline component will be only responsible for displaying this array on the page, but all data manipulations and all modifications of this array will be handled in a root component. And from the root component, data will flow into particular child components. And this way we're going to have one source of truth, which will be located inside of the root component. So let's open up the timeline component inside of the editor. We're going to cut this line which generates timeline items and place it within up component. Along with this, we should also move the import of the generate timeline items function into this component. In here we'll already import one function, so let's add another function name in this import, generate timeline items. And now, since this timeline items array is generated within app component, we're gonna use another prop called timeline items. And in here we will pass that array of timeline items. As always, we have to explicitly accept those props which components will receive. And we do this by using macro define props and specifying names of accepted props in the form of array. So after this change, we will not notice any differences, but internally timeline items array is generated at the top level in app component, and then it is passed down to the timeline component, so that the timeline component is still able to render all those list items. And then inside of the timeline component, every individual list item is getting passed as a prop into timeline item components. And individual timeline item components are responsible to render individual timeline items from the timeline items array. And now that we have done that, time to go to the timeline item component and add markup for the select element. Let's add here div, within which we add select element with only one option element. We're gonna make first option selected by default, also make it disabled, and the value will be an empty string. And if none of the activities will be selected by default, we will show default placeholder rest. And now let's add a few more activities. To be able to test this select element, we're gonna use coding, reading, and training. And as we can see, within every timeline item there is one select element. Let's continue and start applying styles to this select element. We're gonna make this select element occupy the whole width of the parent container by using class wfull. And then if the text inside will exceed available space, we're going to truncate it by using class truncate. And then let's round corners of the select element, make background color gray, vertical padding will be 1 unit, horizontal padding 2 units. And we will increase text size by making it 2XL. And here's what our select element looks like right now. Now it's time to add a little button to the left of this element. This button will be responsible for resetting value of this select element. Let's go ahead and create button tag right above the select element. And within this button, we're gonna use appropriate icon with the name xmarkIcon. And at the same time, let's specify the height for this icon. For this, we will use Tailwind CSS class h8. And in order to use this custom icon component, we firstly have to import it. Let's copy import of icons from another file, paste it within timeline item component, and use import of the icon that we need with the name xmarkIcon. Let's make sure that our icon has appeared on the page and continue. We're gonna style this button a little bit, round the corners, make background color gray, padding will be 3 units. And now we're gonna use Tailwind CSS class, which is gonna be applied only under certain conditions. When this button will be enabled, as well as when the cursor be on top of this button. Under these circumstances, we're gonna make background color gray with a little darker tint. In other words, we will darken this button a little bit. Then, when this button will be disabled, we will use class cursor not allowed, which is basically going to change cursor shape. And also let's add one more class when the button will be disabled. And this class will add transparency to this button. So once the button is disabled, it will also visually look like it is disabled. So now we have to position both these elements on one line. Let's add a few classes to the wrapper div. We'll make this div flexible container, and the distance between child elements will be 2 units. And here's what we got at this moment, styles more or less done. And now let's go back to the timeline item component and render options in a little bit different way. Since we use Vue, we don't need to repeat markup of option elements. Instead, what we'll do is use before directive, which will help us render markup of specified elements several times. We're gonna go over array called options, which will hold all our options for this select element. On every loop iteration, we will receive value and label variables, and then use this value variable, which will basically store value of every select option. We'll use as a value for attributes key an attribute value on this option element. And to bind value of this variable to those attributes, we use the bind directive or its shorthand form column. And eventually let's interpolate value of the label variable and use it as a text for this option element. And now it's time to declare this options array, which is going to store objects. We'll create this array in here, and every object of this array will represent individual option elements for select box. Every object in here will have 2 properties called value and label, and let's fill in those properties with dummy values. And if we check it out on the page, as we can see, option labels are displayed wrongly, because instead of the label, they render value property. So let's go back to the editor and understand why that happened. The reason is that I've used the wrong braces within before directive, since on every loop iteration we receive one object from options array, and in order to destructure this object in here, instead of the parentheses we have to use curly braces. And after we change this, if we take a look on the page, we'll see that all option labels are properly shown, and all those individual select elements are rendered based on the options property that is declared inside of timeline item component. We'll continue working on this select element in the next lesson.